which one crucifies oneself. The 63rd gate is the pressure to formalize. You see, the anxiety of having doubt and suspicion is that that is not something that is anything more than a pressure. It's not like you really know why you're doubtful and suspicious. You don't. Any more than the abstract person doesn't know why suddenly there's that sequence there. Why am I remembering that now? There's this pressure to come up with the formula that says, this is what's the matter. I know now why I'm suspicious. I'm suspicious because of this. Think about the joke of the mind. The joke of the mind is that the moment that you get from the pressure to the ajna, you get to a very, very simple because. It's always because. And because can also be chaos, you know. What are you going to do with that? It's just because. You know, this makes sense to me because. This is what's wrong with the pattern because. This is the nature of our awareness. Mental awareness is the question why and the answer because. If you don't come up with an answer, you're full of anxiety. We manufacture becauses. You know, that's the biggest thing in our life. We run around manufacturing becauses because we're trying to get rid of our anxiety. And with every because that you manufacture, you just end up with another why. There's a vast difference between the collective mind and the individual mind. A vast difference. Individuality is the only continuity as a circuit that operates through the entire vehicle. And because of that, that individuality has a different sort of function. It holds it all together. And its process is never visual. Its process is always acoustic. The acoustic mind operates at a very different level because it does not operate visually. So what is stored in the prana of the life are sounds. The individual inspiration is acoustic. The value, for example, of music as a way of inspiring. Everything having to do with individuality has to do with acoustics and therefore has to do with sound and music. Frequencies. So in the course of the prana of life, we're not simply taking in this dominant human visual perspective, but we're taking in this deep acoustic prana. The sounds of everything. The sounds of that are far beyond the concentrated perspective that we have with sound. Listening for the obvious. This is about an acoustic phenomena that takes place beyond the obvious. That is, it's taking in all the sound of an experience, the frequencies of an experience. And these get stored in the brain. And they come back as impulses of sound. The 61st gate is called inner truth. It's the yin between sets of yang. It's another sandwich. The fuel of mystery. You know, it's one of those nice jokes. There's history, his story, and there's mystery, my story, and here's the my story. The mystery is that it is a pulse of sound, frequency. These are noisy minds. They're not remembering minds. That is, they're not visual, so they're not fixed on certain things. These are just noisy minds. And they're noisy in the sense that the noise doesn't have to be audible. In other words, the pressure is that there is frequency and sound, but there's no orchestration. That is, there's no way of bringing those pulses of frequency and turning them into something. You know, there's a misnomer with this channel because it's called the channel of the thinker. But knowers don't actually think. They're waiting for the sound to make some kind of expression. They're pondering, they're staring, there's actually very little going on. You know, it's not like they're looking at pictures. There is this pressure that there is something there that can be resolved, but what is it? That's its mystery. You know what that's like in the dark when you hear something and you try to figure out what it is. What is that sound? And of course, every sound has an incredible value. The way in which the brain stores language is in tiny, 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 tiny little bits that are manufactured as sound. And these little bits are all there. And the thinker, you know, this pose, the joke is, of course, that they're nothing that they're thinking about. They're just waiting for somebody to play the music. That's all. You know, how all these notes become something. This is the pressure to know. And the pressure to know is the pressure to find absolute silence. You can see what that means for the nature of mutation itself. That the goal of mutation is to end the mutation. Is to get to the place of silence and completion. And of course that doesn't happen. You know. What we get is these moments of silence. And then there's always a new melody. You know, the world is a melody. For me, life itself can be seen so clearly as just this vast orchestra. You know, and you've got your part to play the piccolo for 82 years, so you play the piccolo for 82 years. And then they don't need piccolo players anymore, not your piccolo anyway. And if you're lucky, you come back and play the bassoon, you know, or the trumpet or whatever you do. You know, we reincarnate into the orchestra. We just might get different sections and instruments to play. Anxiety. No deeper anxiety than individual anxiety. To know that something is there and yet not to be able to resolve it. Not to know what it is. Because knowing is so deeply, deeply personal. And at this level, it is the possibility of what is always new. The 61st gate can always bring something new. A mutative inspiration. The pressure to rationalize. The pressure to transform the pulse into a possibility, into a potential, actually. To try to come to grips with what the mystery is. Think about the way the individual mind works. It's like you take a string of melody into your mind. And you turn it over and over and over and over and over. And what you're really doing is that you're getting to know that melody. This is the knowing. You keep returning to it. That's the other side of the 61. You keep returning to it. to make it rational, to give it a fixed form so it can survive. Knowing is only of value if it adds to survival. When you take all of these pressures that are running across the surface for us, the first thing to recognize in that, of course, is that there is no tribal circuitry in the mind. The things that run our civilization, the nature of how we operate sexually, the nature of our communities, our basic laws, the way in which we make money, the way in which we distribute the resources of the community. None of this has anything to do with the mental processes. You know, the mind is basically collective, because the individual process is there to disturb the collective, to create mutation. And of course, mutation is always disturbing to the collective. It wasn't like that in the old days, says the abstract. That means my pattern isn't going to work in the future, says the logic. We're going to have to start all over again. So the mutative mind is always going to be disturbing to the collective mind. You know, the collective mind has its set stuff. And all of a sudden there's this new pressure placed on them. The moment that you give up the authority of your mind making decisions for you, you eliminate that pressure as an anxiety that gets established within you. It will not eliminate the anxiety. The anxiety, the fear will be necessary for you in order to make sure that you really care about the way you communicate. Because the ultimate anxiety that comes out of the ajna is whether or not you can finally translate that metamorphically through the throat into communication. Can I make myself understood is a logical anxiety. Can I stimulate other people with my idea is an abstract anxiety. Am I able to explain my knowing to someone else is an individual anxiety. It will not eliminate the fear. It'll take away the destructive aspect of the fear. And you'll be left with the motivating fear. It's important that you're concerned about how you communicate. It's essential that it is of value to us to communicate properly. And so the anxiety in that sense is legitimate. But the moment you give your mind authority for your own decision making, then you turn all that pressure in on yourself. And that's the moment that you really have to deal with that anxiety. And it's not comfortable, as you all know, because it cannot be resolved through action. I mean, think about that. Be clear about that. You know, the moment you're dwelling on your own personal anxieties, it's not like you can resolve them in the world. What you do is what happens to you. It's not what you want or think you need to do in order to resolve whatever it is that you've got an anxiety about. What you'll discover is that you'll hold on to your anxiety while your life goes on anyway. And you'll dig into the pocket of that anxiety all of the time. And get even more anxious because your life keeps on going the way it goes and you can't seem to do anything about the anxiety going away. You know, the mind's not driven by a motor. And therefore it's useless for you to sit on your mind and say, you make the decisions for my life. You know, then you end up with a pressure that is productive in your process and productive for others, the value you have in giving that to others.